Support for the Capital Connection comes from New York State United Teachers, working to support students, educators, and public schools as the center of their communities through the Public Schools Unite Us initiative. It's the Capital Connection. Hi, I'm David Gustina. This week, joined by Dan Clark. He's the author of the Capital Confidential newsletter for the Times-Union. He covers New York State government and policy. He's been doing it for more than a decade. Before joining the Times-Union in 2024, Dan Clark was the managing editor of WMHT's New York Now. I'm sure many of you who listen to this program know that program as well. He's had stints at PolitiFact, New York Law Journal, Capital Tonight. He is reachable at dan.clark@timesunion.com. Dan Clark, welcome to the Capital Connection.
Delighted to be here.
Well, we'll see about that, won't we, Dan? No. This is not a police interrogation. This is a conversation. You and I have been covering politics for a while now. You know, let's start with a question about you, Dan.
Sure.
What got you into journalism and, more importantly, wanting to cover what some might call the dreck of New York State government and politics?
Well, it's interesting. My start in journalism was the 2008 election. I was just fascinated by the coverage of everything from the rise of Barack Obama, really. That election just fascinated me. I couldn't keep my eyes off of the television, and I decided then that I wanted to do that same thing. I didn't end up on TV, which is great because I didn't love doing TV very much. But about 10 years ago, 12 years ago, I interned at an outlet called State Watch. They cover the state capitol, and I was hooked after that. Going in every day, seeing what they do, I just find it so exhilarating. It's really exciting.
Why don't so many others find it exhilarating and interesting? I mean, if we really think about it, Dan Clark, we're talking about the information from the New York State Capitol that has the largest impact on the citizenry of probably any information they're going to imbibe.
Yeah.
So why don't we pay attention to this stuff?
Well, I think a lot of people don't actually know how much what happens at the state capitol directly impacts them. I think a lot of people think that all of those costs that come down on them are a result of the federal government, not the state government. When in reality, obviously your state income taxes come from the state, but your property taxes are determined by how much state aid gives to the municipality. And then they have to raise the tax levy to fill that gap. A lot happens at the Capitol in every area of everybody's life. People just don't realize how much it touches them.
And how much, in your mind, do the politicians realize that and many times don't have the motivation to protest against some piece of legislation or motivates them more to support some piece of legislation?
I actually think that they believe that the electorate really understands what they're doing, but the electorate does not, I can tell you, because a great example is after this past election, Democrats at the state capitol had a renewed focus on the topic of affordability. Now, you and I and everybody listening might say, this is no news to us. New York is a high cost of living state. Affordability is a problem here and has been a problem for years. But people at the state capitol, the Democrats there who control the legislature, see that as a new issue. And for them, that kind of creates this perception of being a little bit out of touch. And I think that they can get through to voters, but in reality, voters may not realize what they're doing.
It's a really good perspective, Dan Clark. The other side of this, obviously, is the cost of living is so high because New York offers so many services to so many people in an attempt to make life a little bit easier, whether it's health care through the services they provide, child care, whatever it might be. New York goes further than a lot of other states do to try to level the playing field. And that seems to get lost in the mix. It seems to suggest, oh, well, we're spending all this money, but what are we spending it on? And are we getting some form of return? Even if you or I don't benefit, do we have the understanding that, yes, I want in my state, New York, to make sure that the child who go hungry won't go hungry?
Yeah, and I think that's a universal issue. I mean, the big part of state spending that people may not realize, the biggest thing that the state spends money on is Medicaid. But when you look at Medicaid, that's health care for low income people. If you take that away, if you take that health coverage away, people are going to go to the hospital anyway. They're going to go to the emergency room. They don't have the money to pay that bill. So the hospital is going to have to foot that cost, and then the state is going to have to make up that cost to the hospital anyway. So the whole point of Medicaid is to be able to get those people that preventive care so we don't end up in that situation. So in a state like this, one of the critiques of our Medicaid program is that we require coverage for a lot of things that other states don't, and that happens to drive up the cost as well as other parts of the program too.
And yet again, the other side is to try to keep the population healthy.
Exactly.
So that down the road, the long-term costs are lower.
Yeah, that's exactly it.
Well, and, we're being accused now, as I read in a recent story by Dan Clark, it says here, that we're being accused of Medicaid malfeasance by a congressional panel. And we have until July 16th, that's the Hochul administration, to produce materials related to these allegations.
Yeah.
We hear these allegations all the time,
right?
And from what I can tell, when you look at a nonpartisan budget office, for example, looks at some of this stuff, they find very little fraud.
Yeah, no, that's exactly it. I mean, the Medicaid Inspector General's office, for example, has not found any great areas of fraud. This issue that Congress is looking at is a difference in interpretation of what the state can do with federal Medicaid dollars. And not to get too much into the weeds, but it basically has to do with how much the state reimburses for Medicaid and whether that can be matched with federal money. And Republicans in Congress are saying that the state kind of played a bait and switch to hold on to its own money while making that federal money come into municipalities and hospitals.
Now, the fights are going to continue now that the big, beautiful bill has passed, and we're going to start to see those cuts and the impact of those cuts playing out across the country, specifically in New York State. We just mentioned Medicaid. You've got SNAP benefits. The food pantries are crying out for help. All sorts of issues to come. And that's now after we've had a session and a budget passed and perhaps a need to revisit some of that legislation and the monies that are allocated. And they knew that that was on the table. That's the legislature operated as normal. And I'm guessing, because we're hearing it already, the assembly looking at potentially coming back. But they're going to have to deal with this one way or the other, aren't they, Dan?
They are, but it depends on how they deal with it. These cuts from this bill are billions and billions of dollars. And if the state is going to fill that gap from the federal government, that money has to come from somewhere. So what the governor has said and what lawmakers have said is that they can't backfill that money. It's so much that they would have to raise taxes across the board to make up that gap. And that's not something that they want to do. Now, if they can soften the blow, that's another story. And we don't know how they would be able to do that. In areas like food stamps, SNAP, there is a possibility that state funding could help bridge that gap, but not cover it completely. Same thing with these Medicaid cuts. And a lot of the Medicaid cuts come from eligibility changes. So it's not necessarily something that the state can hone in on anyway. The impact for a lot of people is just going to be devastating. And I think that there's a sense in the legislature and for the governor that there's not much that they can do about it. So what I've seen and what I predict will happen is that they're probably going to use this politically for next year's elections.
Yeah, it's going to be a hammer, right?
Absolutely.
They're going to say they did this to you. That's the Republicans. Blame them. So you're going to have that blame game. Unfortunately, too, when states go bad, sometimes it's the leader of the state that gets blamed along with the rest. So you've got Governor Hochul there looking at her potential prospects, and she's got people lining up to challenge her based on where she stands in the polls. So you really are going to see the political gamesmanship ratcheting up as we begin to see these cuts play out, aren't we?
And you already have, really. I mean, the governor has been trying to pressure the Republican members of Congress from New York for months now to avoid this exact situation of putting the state in a scenario where we have these billions of dollars in gaps for healthcare, for education, all the things that the federal government supports. You know, not everything is being cut, but there are certainly restrictions in a lot of areas that the state just isn't prepared to do anything about. And I think you're exactly right that this is really useful ammunition for the governor in a sense that because there's not much the state can do to fill these gaps and to help people get through this, her only option really is to use it to campaign for Democrats in Congress, to flip the majority there and maybe undo some of this. Of course, with President Trump in the White House, that probably wouldn't happen, but that's something that she can do to also say, look at me, I am doing the right thing, give me another term in office.
Yeah, and so far she's well ahead of her competitors in the latest Siena poll.
Oh, yeah.
However, she does have this very strange and interesting, from a journalistic perspective, challenge coming from her lieutenant governor of all people, Antonio Delgado, the former congressman who decided not to run for re-election in the 19th district, and then he jumped into the Hochul administration as lieutenant governor, and just decides, I don't want to play lieutenant governor for you anymore. They have this public spat, and now he's challenging her for her own office.
I think that he thought when he was becoming lieutenant governor that he was getting into something that wasn't what it turned out to be. I think that he thought when he came in that this was going to be a collaborative relationship with Governor Hochul to really enact some major changes that he wanted to see on the state level. Instead, like how Andrew Cuomo did to Kathy Hochul decided that Antonio Delgado was going to kind of do these ribbon-cutting roles and these kind of ceremonial things that don't necessarily enact real change. And we now know, after he's announced his campaign for governor, looking at his issue areas, that he is further to the left than Hochul. He's calling for raising taxes on the wealthy and corporations, something that Governor Hochul has said that she will not do while she's in office. So it's going to be a really interesting test for the Democratic Party and for the electorate in general as to, are they looking for a centrist Democrat to fill this office? Or does the statewide, in terms of Democrats, do they want to see the party shift a little bit further to the left? And I think that'll be fascinating to watch next year.
Oh, it's so fascinating, because by saying that, you're referencing the New York City primary and what we've seen with Zohran Mamdani, and the fact that these establishment folks like the former governor, Andrew Cuomo, like the current mayor, Eric Adams, those that tend to run to the center during the general election while trying to say they're progressives during the primary, doesn't wash with a lot of Democrats these days. You see Bernie Sanders, the Vermont senator, and AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Congress, have been drawing huge crowds. And Mamdani is parroting exactly what they're parroting. So you combine that in New York with Antonio Delgado, also a more lefty on the Democratic spectrum. And you can see this push me, pull you fight going on in the Democratic Party, that the centrists always seem to win, and yet they're not making the arguments that resonate with people.
That's exactly it. I mean, one thing that people miss in terms of they don't see in Donald Trump is that a big reason why his message went so far is because it was a clear populist message. Him saying, I'm going to help you out with your affordability issues. Antonio Delgado is pitching the same thing in his campaign for governor. AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and Bernie Sanders say the same thing. They want to tell low-income people that they don't have to be low income anymore, that we can do things as a society to lift them up in a sense of a rising tide lifts all ships. And I think nowadays in politics, it's less so that your positions pick the person that you are going to support. It's more you pick the person, and that determines your positions on a lot of things. So you have a lot of people who turn to these big names and then kind of fall in line with everything that they believe as well. When at the end of the day, what they really just want is that populist message of affordability, lowering the cost of living, and making sure that people don't fall behind when they don't have to.
So if you look into your crystal ball, Dan Clark, do you see a clear winner coming out of this general election in New York City for mayor?
Right now, no. But if I were a betting man, I would say Zohran Mamdani will win the election. New York City Mayor Eric Adams, the incumbent, is running as an independent, but he also faced those federal bribery charges that have not lost him at all. Even though they're not on him anymore, people still resonate that with him. So his numbers have not been great in the polls. Then you have Andrew Cuomo, who may run as an independent, but Eric Adams isn't going to drop out. So if Andrew Cuomo jumps in, they split the vote enough that Mamdani has a really strong way forward. And then you have Curtis Sliwa, the Republican candidate, who is not likely to win, ran before and doesn't have the numbers to get there. You also have another independent candidate, Jim Walden, who is very unknown, who is not polling votes either. So if everything stays as it is right now, Mamdani is a shoo-in for the office unless Eric Adams can somehow convince voters that he should get a second term.
But if Mamdani wins, is that good for New York City or not in the context of President Donald Trump already blasting Mamdani and, talking about him being a socialist and he is a democratic socialist, but, the idea that we're going to get him out of there if we have to.
Yeah, the thing is, the mayor of New York City does work with the federal government quite a bit. And if Trump and Zohran Mamdani cannot see eye to eye on literally anything, that is a problem for New York City, unless New York City decides to go its own on a lot of these things. But there's a lot that New York City relies on in terms of federal funding, especially infrastructure. I mean, the New York City subway system gets a lot of federal funding. Everything in New York City that you see out in the public, like even law enforcement, relies on federal funding in some way, shape, or form. So President Trump has a lot of power here to really impact New York City. Whether he wants to do it is another question. I mean, he has Trump Tower there. He does have businesses there. So it's not in his best interest necessarily to decimate the city, but he can make life a little harder.
And the city is also a creature of the state where the mayor is going to have to come hat in hand to the legislature and ask for monies. And as we just talked about, Kathy Hochul leading all comers. And if she wins, she might, in leading the state, not be as warm to the mayor of New York City and all of his asks.
Well, I think that's it, right? Is if Zohran Mamdani can't communicate with the White House, he has a nice go-between with Kathy Hochul if he needs it. Hochul is not by any means an ally of Donald Trump, but she has shown repeatedly that she can sit down with him and find common ground on issues like infrastructure, like energy independence in New York State. So she has that ability. Whether she can go there and say, this is what Zohran Mamdani wants and get it back is another question.
Interesting to me that, and we'll take a little side trip because you mentioned energy, but what you're referring to is nuclear.
Yeah.
That Governor Hochul came out, and to many it was a surprise, at least the people I've spoken to, that she decided to support nuclear. But when you have the Trump administration cutting a lot of the environmental regulation and even taking some funding that was already allocated and freezing it, and the Bond Act we have in New York, all the climate legislation, and trying to reach our climate goals, one of the only options in her arsenal there at that point would be nuclear, and she's gone for it. Could be good for her.
It could be really good for her. The problem is that nuclear power takes a long time to build.
Yeah.
So she can make that announcement this year, but it's not like we're going to have a new nuclear power plant by next year when she's up for re-election. At the same time, if she can tell people, hey, we're going to make clean energy, meet our clean energy goals, our climate goals, without raising the cost on your ratepayer bills, that's going to be really popular with people. Because as we've seen in the past couple of months, those utility companies are really trying to drive up rates, in some sense, to meet those climate goals to help the state. But a lot of it is repairing this aging infrastructure that they just haven't been able to replace for many, many years. That's the top excuse for all of them. And some of that has to do with the new climate goals. But a lot of it just has to do with it's going to break if they don't fix it.
Right. And with the climate change that's happened, we've already seen land collapse on Amtrak and stop the train, and pieces of building falling down in New York City on the tracks. All sorts of things as a result of climate change, and as just normal wear and tear, you need to keep the system modernized. And to that end is the congestion pricing plan, which has gotten a lot of news, obviously negative, especially in the beginning with the idea of charging people $8, $9 down below 60th Street. In Manhattan, it's a tax, it's a tax, it's a tax. We even heard it from Democrats and Republicans against Hochul's push for that. And we saw the Trump administration come in and try to stop it. They put one deadline after another. But anecdotally, and even in some of the data, it seems to be working. And so, you've got this money, this plan, congestion pricing, that is supposed to do just what you're talking about, and yet they want to fight it.
They want to fight it, and it goes back to the economic issue. A lot of people in the New York City suburbs commute into Manhattan. The New York City suburbs, if people don't know, are the political battleground of New York State. Those are those districts that are purple districts. They're going to go either blue or red. Nobody knows until the final day. Those commuters are really upset that they have to pay that toll. So if Republicans, like the president, can come in and say, we're going to get rid of that toll, that's some good votes for his candidates.
Yeah, and it's just that raw politics that people get, and probably is one of the many reasons that pushes them away from paying attention, right? I mean,
Yes.
You've watched this game a long time. When you can sit there and know exactly what answer you're going to get from a politician before you ask the question, that's not necessarily a good place to be, because they're not thinking about the issue and a potential solution. They're thinking about the political perception of what they're about to say and how it will impact their reelection.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there is other climate legislation in the legislature that a lot of Democrats support, but a lot of Democrats don't support it because of the political implications. If that bill is seen as potentially raising costs for ratepayers, those are votes that they're going to lose because Republicans are going to oppose that legislation. Of course, you have a lot of Democrats in the legislature who are safe in their seat. They're never going to get challenged seriously by somebody from another party. And those are the lawmakers who are often the loudest voices in support of this legislation. But then you have your upstate Democrats and your suburban Democrats who have enough power in the legislature to say, pump the brakes. If we do this, we're going to make people really upset. And in a lot of ways, it is politics, but that's also representing your electorate at the end of the day.
Well, Dan Clark from the Times-Union, Capital Confidential, we are in an interesting spot right now when it comes to the legislation known as medical aid in dying.
Yeah.
10 years these groups worked on this legislation. They got it through both houses. It sits now on the governor's desk awaiting to see what she will do. And it's been really, crickets coming out of the state capitol. There are a lot of pressure groups, obviously, on either side, but do you have any sense in your conversations with folks of where the governor is on this legislation and what she will do?
I think that she would lean towards approving the legislation. The argument that got it across the finish line in the Senate, where it was maybe not going to pass this year, was the argument of bodily autonomy. If you're going to support reproductive rights, then you have to also support medical aid in dying. The governor is a huge supporter of reproductive rights, wants to ensure that New York's abortion laws stay on the books, are not limited in any way. If she were to turn around and veto this legislation, it would kind of be against that same position that she had on reproductive rights. So I see her being open to it and probably approving it. At the same time, there is a major misinformation campaign about this bill that's gone on saying, all of these terrible things that could happen if it's signed into law. And that's every misinformation campaign. You try to scare people into a certain position. The governor is not easily scared into a position, but she is cognizant of the impact that misinformation can have, especially on residents of New York State. If somebody in upstate New York or anywhere really thinks that this bill is going to do something terrible, even though it's not, and then she signs it, I mean, that's not good for her. That's not good for her electorate. I think that she also has to take that into account.
Oh, yeah, you have to take that into account. But in the end, your mom said, do the right thing. And in this particular case, I believe, my opinion now, that Corinne Carey, Compassion and Choices, those folks spent that time listening to what the arguments against it were and building the legislation to mitigate those issues. The problem with things like, well, your relative's going to force you to take yourself out so they can get a hold. Well, no, we've put in this legislation. No, you have to have, the doctor has to know. It has to be this kind of lethal disease. Anyway, it's amazing to me, amidst all of this, that we're talking about total Democratic control in the state legislature, and still some of these issues that when it was more balanced, they would blame the Republicans for. They still can't get some of these issues out of their House, especially the Senate in some cases, because of the political ramifications.
That's it. And a lot of people don't realize that at the state capitol, it's no longer Democrats versus Republicans. Now it's progressives versus centrists in the Democratic Party. So you do still have these two sides, They just both happen to be on the left now. So there's still that same push and pull, tug of war, but it's of more like-minded people, and they're all trying to get to the same place. They just disagree on how to get there. So I think it's a little bit easier for them to govern, but it's still a headache for a lot of the centrists who still control the majority of the legislature.
He's Dan Clark, author of the Capitol Confidential newsletter for the Times-Union. He covers New York State government and policy. Don't go anywhere, Dan. Keep reporting and telling it like it is, and maybe you'll come back and talk to us again on the Capitol Connection.
Anytime, genuinely.
Thank you. Support for the Capitol Connection comes from New York State United Teachers, working to support students, educators, and public schools as the center of their communities through the Public Schools Unite Us initiative.